Hello, everyone, and welcome to Compassionate Christian Voices today and tomorrow. My name is Brian Elaine. I'm the founder of Compassionate Christianity and a few other projects. It's a pleasure to host this series of prominent Christian authors and activists. Today is the 9th webinar in this series, and we will have additional webinars this Thursday and on Tuesday and Thursday next week. Joining us today are Kelly Douglas Brown, Parker J. Palmer, and Lisa Sharon Harper. The Very Reverend Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas serves as the Dean of Episcopal Divinity School at Union Theological Seminary and the Bill and Judith Moyers Chair in Theology at Union. She's also canon theologian at the Washington National Cathedral and theologian in residence at Trinity Church, Wall Street. Dean Douglas's academic work has focused on womanist theology, sexuality in the Black church, and racial and social justice. She is the author of many articles and books, including Resurrection and Hope, A Future Where Black Lives Matter, Stand Your Ground, Black Bodies and the Justice of God, and Sexuality in the Black Church, A Womanist Perspective. At the time of her 1983 ordination, Kelly was one of the first 10 Black women ordained in the Episcopal Church USA. She holds a master's degree in theology and a PhD in systematic theology from Union Theological Seminary. Parker J. Palmer is a writer, speaker, and activist who focuses on issues of education, community, leadership, spirituality, and social change. He is founder and senior partner emeritus of the Center for Courage and Renewal, which offers long-term retreat programs for people in the serving professions, including teachers, administrators, physicians, philanthropists, nonprofit leaders, and clergy. He holds a PhD in sociology from the University of California at Berkeley, as well as 13 honorary doctorates, 2 Distinguished Achievement Awards from the National Education Press Association, and an Award of Excellence from the Associated Church Press. Parker is the author of 10 books, including Healing the Heart of Democracy, Let Your Life Speak, and On the Brink of Everything. Parker's been named one of the 30 most influential senior leaders in higher education, was given the William Rainey Harper Award, and was named one of 25 visionaries who are changing the world. Lisa Sharon Harper leads training that increases clergy and community leaders' capacity to organize people of faith toward a just world. A prolific speaker, writer, and activist, Lisa is the founder and president of freedomroad.us, a consulting group dedicated to shrinking the narrative gap in our nation by designing forums and experiences that bring common understanding, common commitment, and common action. Lisa is the author of several books, including Fortune, How Race Broke My Family and the World and How to Repair It All, The Very Good Gospel, How Everything Wrong Can Be Made Right, and Forgive Us, Confessions of a Compromised Faith. A columnist at Sojourners Magazine and an Auburn Theological Seminary senior fellow, Lisa has appeared on TV One, Fox News Online, NPR, and Al Jazeera America. Her writing has been featured in CNN Belief Blog, the National Civic Review, Sojourners, the Huffington Post, Relevant Magazine, and Essence Magazine. Lisa earned her master's degree in human rights from Columbia University in New York and served as Sojourners' Chief Church Engagement Officer. She's been named one of the 50 most powerful women religious leaders by the Huffington Post and received the Bridge Award from the Selma Center for Nonviolence, Truth, and Reconciliation. The Religion Communicators Council named a 2-part series within Lisa's Freedom Road podcast as Best Radio and Podcast Series of the Year. So it is such an incredible honor to have the 3 of you here. All you have to do is just hear these incredible accomplishments that you've all made, and can't help but being impressed. And I'm very grateful for you spending some time with us and sharing your thoughts with everyone. So today I'm going to ask our panelists a series of questions, but if anyone else would like to ask something, please type your question into the Q&A box on the Zoom portal, and I'll be monitoring those as we go. So to get started, perhaps each of you could just start telling us a little bit about what your latest project might be, whether that's a book or something else that you've recently completed. And Kelly, I'd really appreciate it if we could start with you.
Well, thank you, Brian. And first of all, let me thank you again for inviting me into this conversation and having the opportunity to be in conversation with these 2 wonderful people and have the opportunity to learn from them both. And so I thank you. So Okay, what I'll talk about, you talk about my sort of latest work is my latest work, which is, as you mentioned, Resurrection, Hope, a future where Black lives matter. And that's the journey that I continue to be on. And that book is a part of a journey. And so, when I wrote that book, and this journey is a journey about faith seeking understanding. And, to do theology, who would know that Anselm, this 11th century theologian, would still speak quite strongly to me as a theologian in understanding that theology is really about trying to answer those questions of faith that emerge in the context of our living. Resurrection Hope for me was about and is about trying to answer these questions of faith that have emerged in the context of my living as a Black woman, as a Black mother, in a global, social, national context in which Black life just seems not to matter. And so I was led to write this book. This book called me to it. I rarely sit down and say, I'm going to write this book, or this is going to be my next project. I fight writing books. I thought Stand Your Ground was the last book that I had in me that I would write, but I was compelled to write this book from not simply because of who I was as a person of faith and a theologian, but because as well who I was as a mother. And my son's continued question to me, from a young adult to now a late 20-something, 6-foot lock-wearing Black man, who continued to ask me if I really ever believed that Black lives would ever come to matter in this nation. And as he asked me that question, I also heard the question, the faith question underneath, because the fact that he could ask that question meant that he was also wondering if our lives really mattered to God. And so I heard echoing in my mind this observation that James Baldwin made some time ago that actually speaks to Black life, and that is that every Black person at some point in their life must come to the shock that the flag that they have pledged allegiance to, that the nation to which they have given their loyalty has not pledged allegiance to them, has not given its loyalty back to them. And I found myself wondering if the God in whom Black people had had faith, the God of Jesus Christ, the God in which I had had faith, if that God was as faithful to me, as faithful to Black people as we have been to that God. And so I was at this crisis of faith, and that's what led me to write the book Resurrection Hope, a future where Black lives matter. I'll stop there as we can talk more about that journey if in fact it's a part of the conversation. But that's the journey I'm on, and that's what propelled me into the book.
Well, thank you, Kelly, and thank you for doing that book. I mean, it's excellent, and we did, by the way, do a full interview with Kelly about that book a while back, so you can find that on our website, actually on the Writing for Your Life website. There's amongst the list of book interviews. So thank you very much, Kelly, for that. Parker, would you like to share next what you've been up to?
Well, I'm so honored to be here, Brian, with Kelly and Lisa, and what Kelly just said, the power and impact of what she just said, I think reveals why I feel honored to be part of this conversation with both of these good people. My most recent book is, I guess, 2 or 3 years old now. It's called On the Brink of Everything: Grace, Gravity, and Getting Old. You will notice that it isn't about getting old gracefully, because I know nothing about that. I feel like I'm stumbling towards, as I've done all my life, towards questions more than answers. But there was an interesting moment of resonance for me when Kelly was speaking, because I suppose in some ways, I hadn't thought of it this way before, that I think I wrote the book in part because there are a lot of elders in this country and in this world who are wondering if their lives matter anymore. Elders of all colors and backgrounds. And I wanted to say loudly and clearly, yes, they do, big time. In fact, I think Old Age on the Brink of Everything, which is a title that I borrowed from one of my young activist friends, who talked about how her 1.5-year-old child walks around wide-eyed all the time because she's on the brink of everything. She's discovering things for the new time, for the first time. And I think there's a kind of beginner's mind rediscovery that's possible in our elder years. Those of us who are lucky enough to get there. Lots and lots of people don't get to be 83 the way I am. And so I regard that as a real privilege. And I want to live that privilege well and offer it up in service wherever I can. So one of the messages in the book is old is just another word for nothing left to lose. So don't retreat to the shallows. Get out there, take a deep dive into all kinds of things. And one of the things I take a deep dive into in the book is white supremacy and white privilege. I am convinced, I am convinced, especially from the work I do with young activists of color, that white people talking to white people about race in America is a very important conversation. And I've been trying to be a part of that conversation, sometimes participating in it, sometimes attempting to lead it, by making my own declarations about what I've learned over the years about white privilege and white supremacy in my life. Among other things, saying that I think it's a real cop-out for white people to equate white supremacy with wearing a hood and burning a cross. It comes in all kinds of forms. And I don't know a single white person who doesn't have an unconscious form of that supremacist assumption inside him or her. And I say that only because I've worked hard to get down to the place where I can acknowledge and confess such places in myself. All kinds of stuff in the book, including encouragement to political engagement and encouragements to engagement with deep self. Thomas Merton, one of my great mentors, although I never met him, mentors like the good folks on the screen right now who come to teach you through books and articles, and also come to feel like fellow travelers on the road. So through Thomas Merton, that opportunity to understand that deep engagement with self and deep engagement with the world are not two different things. They have to do with what I call life on the Mobius strip, where the inner and outer surfaces of our lives, our actions, our decisions, our attitudes, and our activism keep merging into one another and co-creating what we fondly call reality, which is not fixed and given. We have an opportunity to shape and reshape at every moment of our lives. So with lots of gratitude for the opportunity to be here, I'll lay it down there.
Well, thanks so much, Parker. You know, you've got a whole lifetime of incredible work that we've all benefited from, so it's deeply appreciated. And you're inspiring me to write that book that I've been thinking about, Diary of an Old Entrepreneur, how to start a business at age 60, which is what I did when I started writing for your life. So we'll see about that later. But in any event, Lisa, so glad for you to join us. I really appreciate the opportunity to collaborate again with you. So tell us, I know a lot about what you've been up to lately, but please share with everyone else.
Well, thank you so much, Brian. It really has been awesome to partner with you in various ways over the last several months. My latest project is the book Fortune. It really has been a lifetime in the making. I started the research 30 years ago, researching my family. And I didn't start it thinking I was going to write a book. I started it just thinking I need to know who I am. And as an African-American woman, that's a hard thing to do. It's a hard thing to trace your family. So I literally just called my mom up after watching a movie that really moved me, and said, okay, Mom, I need to know who was Grandpop? Who was great Grandpop? Grandmom said there was this thing in our family line. What do you know about that? And so I traced my very first family tree in 1991, and it had no names. It only had relationships and dates when people were born and when they died, we think, and where they lived. And now, 30 years later, there's about 1,600 people on our family tree. And that's working with a genealogist and also working through DNA and matching and all of that kind of thing. And it was in the middle of that search about a decade ago when we discovered that we might be connected to this woman named Fortune Game McGee. Fortune she was born in 1687. And she was also mixed race. Her mother was Ulster Scot and her father was Senegalese. We came to understand that. On the genealogy chart, it just said he was an enslaved African. But now I understand. No, he was Senegalese. His name was Sambo, and that name is a Senegalese name. It means second son, which gave me chills when I learned that. It tells me something of his story. And he was likely put aboard a death ship off the coast, on the Gambia River, hence the name Gam, which became game over time. And so Fortune was taken to court in 1705 because of the very first race laws that passed in Maryland, following 2 years after the very first race laws on this soil in English territory. And so what I saw in her story was that her story was not just hers. It was not just our family story. This was America's story of race. And it helped me to understand the struggles of all the next generations, not even just from her line, but on all the branches of my family tree. So Fortune, the book, actually traces 10 generations of my family, starting with Fortune Game McGee and going all the way up to me, asking the question, how did this construct called race break us as a nation and break the world? And then in the last third, there's 3 essays on truth-telling, reparation, and forgiveness unto the beloved community, as a way for us to ask the question, how do we repair what race broke in the world? So I'll stop there. I'm sure we can talk more about it, but I'll tell you what, when I saw those very first race laws and began to ask the question of how it might have been absorbed into Fortune's 18-year-old mixed race body, and the trauma that she suffered, and all of the people who suffered from those very first race laws, I began to understand why January 6th happened.
Well, again, an incredible book, and I learned so much by reading it. So much about the history and things like that you uncovered, and I had no idea about. So thank you very much for that. And again, we do have a book interview with Lisa that's on our website as well. So I really invite people to take a look at that too. But Lisa, could you also just say a couple words about the big press conference that you had in DC to support the reparations work that's going on in Congress?
Thank you so much for asking that. Yes. And we launched the book realizing that, we're in the middle of COVID era, so we can't necessarily go around the whole country speaking in all these different places. And it was also at the rise of Omicron before B2A or BA2, whatever it is. And so we realized, okay, we're going to have to do this online. So we had a whole month of online events with 2 in-person events that bookended the whole thing. I'm starting at Ebenezer Baptist Church and ending in Puerto Rico, actually, with the Aspen Institute there. But the day after the Aspen Institute gathering, I gathered about, how many of there was? About 16 of my closest friends who are in the movement for racial justice, and also particularly around reparations and truth-telling, including Representative Barbara Lee and Representative Sheila Jackson Lee, and the leaders of the two reparations and truth-telling movements. And we gathered for a press conference at the National Press Center, and had a clarion call. I think it was the day after the State of the Union address, where reparations was not mentioned, and where even truth-telling was not mentioned. And the only reference to race was in the reality that we were now going to put forward the very first African-American Supreme Court Justice, Ketanji Brown Jackson. Praise the Lord, but there's a lot more to be done than that. So we held a press conference in order to call the nation and to call our representatives to pass H.R. 40 and H.Con. Res. 19. These are two House resolutions, House bills that have the votes to pass. Particularly H.R. 40 has the votes to pass now, but we're also calling on the president to pass it by executive order if necessary. So it was a really powerful time, so powerful, in fact, that we broke up the conference into little bite-sized pieces that we then put out on Instagram and Facebook throughout Lent as a Black Fortune Lenten series. So you can catch it there if you'd like.
It was just really a powerful event. So, thank you so much for that, Lisa. Mm-hmm. What I want to get to next is that I know all of you not only are great writers, but you're great readers. And so I'd love for you to share with folks, what you've been reading lately that's really had an impact on you. Parker, maybe we could start with you this time?
Sure. Well, I live in a house full of books. You can see some of them behind me. I think we all do. And my wife and I have, in the last few years, been giving a lot of them away to the public library and to other worthy projects in Madison, Wisconsin, where we live. But it occurred to me, I don't need to buy any more books or download any more books. I should reread some of the formative books of my younger years. And that's quite a long list. I saved all of them. They're dog-eared and heavily marked up. The rereading I've been doing most recently has been in Thomas Merton, and it relates, the particular stuff I've been rereading relates to the topics that we're exploring on this webinar. Merton early in his career wrote a pious book called Seeds of Contemplation, and then New Seeds of Contemplation. It was beloved by many. Then he wrote a book about race called Seeds of Destruction, which was not beloved by many of those who loved him for Seeds of Contemplation. It often happens to people who get identified as, quote, spiritual writers, that if they start writing about the implications of their spirituality or their faith, people get upset with them who thought they were just good, pious folks who weren't going to rock the boat. And so Merton wrote Seeds of Destruction about what he saw in the early 60s as the fire next time, the coming conflagration of the races, fueled by white supremacy, fueled by the same thing that fueled January 6th. And he was taken to task for this by white activists who said, we're on the front lines here in the early 60s. We're making tracks, we're making changes. We're working on a post-racial society. We just don't see it. And who are you, Thomas Merton, to comment this way when you're living in a hermitage in the hills of Kentucky, out there in the woods, the protected life of a Trappist monk? What they didn't know was a couple of things about Merton. One was that he was, because his friends in Kentucky would come to the woods and sneak stuff into him, notably fried chicken and beer, but also recordings of the blues and of gospel music that he loved listening to, that he was in dialogue through music and through other reading with what was going on in the Black liberation movement at that time. And they also did not know that it's possible in a life of deep contemplation to connect more profoundly with what's going on in the world than it sometimes is on the front lines of activism, where a lot of ego gets involved and invoked, and people start convincing themselves that everything is going to change, when in fact this tragic gap between what is and what should and could be has a long way to go, always has and always will. So by the end of the 60s, Merton was vindicated. One white activist, Martin Marty, who at one time was the editor of Christian Century, actually wrote a public apology to Merton for having wrongly understood and interpreted the book Seeds of Destruction. And one of Merton's key themes here, which I find very powerful, is that if we can't begin to come to terms with the alien within ourselves, and also more deeply for people of faith, understand that God is the alien within ourselves. God is not a domestic house pet. God is not tame or tameable. If we can't begin to deal with that, then we can't begin to deal with the quote alien or quote stranger in the world around us. And I think, in spiritual terms, that's a very powerful theme that casts a very bright light on a church that likes to domesticate God, that likes to contain the experience of the holy, that tends to drain that experience of anything radical or upsetting or, tipping over of the tables or the norms. And so that's kind of a focus of contemplation for me and meditation for me, as I reacquaint myself with the many works of Thomas Merton. And I'll just also add that every morning, as part of my spiritual practice, I read poetry. From poetry, I get insights that I cannot get from prose, and occasionally from writing a poem, I'll be able to say something that I cannot figure out how to say in prose. And so I read people like Marge Piercy and Langston Hughes and Gerard Manley Hopkins and Lucille Clifton and Naomi Shihab Nye, Mary Oliver and William Stafford. Emily Dickinson once said, "Tell the truth, but tell it slant," because if you run right at it or stare right at it, it'll blind you and you won't even know you won't even get a glimpse of the truth. Well, the poets, I think, serve me that way. They tell the truth, but they tell it slant, and they give my weak eyes a chance to adjust to the brightness that I hope someday to see beyond the glass darkly.
Wow. Well, thank you, Parker. I wish I could enjoy poetry the way that you do. Lisa, how about you? What have you been reading lately?
It's funny, I've actually been reading for the first time 1619 Project. I got the book. I don't even think it's behind me. It's usually right behind me, but it's actually now up in my room because I've been reading it. And I'm reading it in preparation for, first of all, to go deeper even in my own study, but also in preparation for a pilgrimage that I'm doing along with, Freedom Road was commissioned by Trinity UCC to do an established 1619 pilgrimage through Charleston. Now, Charleston was not established 1619. It was a little bit later than that. But Charleston is the port through which the majority of African Americans can trace their heritage, having gone through that port. So we're taking 200, yes, count them, 200 people, yes, on 4 buses through Charleston over the course, all over and around the area over the course of 5 days in June, in 2 months. And so I wanted to make sure that that I did have Nicole Hannah-Jones's input into the storytelling that we'll be doing according, throughout the time. That's the reading that I'm doing.
Wow. When is the bus trip taking place?
So it's taking place June 20 through 24. It'll be starting, and we're going through all Freedom Road pilgrimages go through a story. We always start with a beginning, a middle, and we have a right now, which actually leads us to advocacy in the end. And so our story will trace the entry, the subjugation and rebellion, and then the rise of Africans on U.S. soil. And so we will be on plantations. We will be at Fort Moultrie, which was right there at the entry point and also the point for the Revolutionary War. We're going to stand on the land where the Stono Rebellion happened, and also go to the Penn Center where there was amazing educational work that happened right after the Civil War, where people of African descent around the country actually came in order to free African Americans, came to help teach English to enslaved Africans so that they could read, write, and vote.
Wow. So are you going to be like blogging or video,
Yeah.
Good.
That's a great question. Just today, we were actually saying, yes, we need to do that.
Yeah. We can all follow along, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
With your journey, even though we can't physically be there. Well, that'd be awesome.
Exactly. We've just been getting everything else in, but now we actually have to get our blogger in place. And
well, yet another logistic thing, I'm sure, of the gazillion logistic things that are going to be difficult for that trip. But
yeah,
thank you for including that.
Absolutely.
Kelly, how about you? What have you been reading lately?
Yes, thank you. First, let me say, Lisa, I feel like we're running parallel lives here. So I look forward to talking beyond this conversation, even as you talk about truth and reparations and the 1619 Project, which was our book read for our students in our cohort.
Wow.
And so I read and reread that project because there's so much there. But what I am currently reading, and I'm like Parker Palmer and Lisa, we're reading several things at once. And so I'll talk about two books that have right now most struck me. Maybe three, but all very briefly comments about them. One is I'm rereading. I read it some time ago and just reopened it to reread again, which is Leopold's Ghost by Adam Hochschild, which is about, of course, Leopold II's takeover, if you will, of the Congo. And the reason that I picked it back up is because you always forget sort of the details, but I remembered in the beginning, the way the first human rights, if you will, international human rights struggle emerged from one man named Edmund Morel, who noticed in Liverpool, and he was watching ships come in. He worked the shipyard, just an ordinary man. And he watched these ships come in from the Congo, and he recognized that while things were coming in, nothing was going out. And he wondered, he said, something's wrong. He noticed there was this moral recognition that something was not right. And of course, it led him to recognize that they were actually trading in lives and the exploitation that was going on in the Congo. And that led this singular man with moral recognition and this sort of what I say, this moral instinct to know that this isn't right. And it took one man to have that recognition, that instinct, and that courage to begin to mount a movement, a moral movement, if you will, in response to what was going on in the Congo. For obvious reasons of what's going on in this country, you would know why he came back to the forefront of my mind, and I reopened the book. The other book that I have reopened is Isabel Wilkerson's The Warmth of Other Suns. Right? And these are the stories, like the 1619 Project, Lisa, that are now being sort of outlawed, if you will, in our schools. These stories that give us a window into who we are as a nation, and not only who we are as a nation, but the possibilities of who we can become as a nation and as a people. And if we don't know these stories that are not the romanticized stories of who we are, we don't know these difficult and uncomfortable stories, well, first of all, we're missing out on wisdom, the wisdom of resilience, the wisdom of hope, the wisdom of faith. And we're also missing out on understanding not only the realities of injustice, but what makes justice possible, right? And so I turned back to these stories of, which are letters of people, Black people who took part in the Great Migration, if you would, migrations from the South to the North, because again, I keep hearing my son's voice in my head where he continues to say, up until even our conversation we had last week, Black people need to just get out of here. And so what that's, people in the South said, we got to get up and go. We got to move. And to begin to understand, then now realizing, maybe we got to move back. Where we going to go? But really now trying to understand, it was a movement that we understand now as a movement, but for the people taking part in it, it was people in search of a better way of being in the world where their lives would matter, and to truly try to understand. And that movement made our nation better in some respects. So I'm back to Isabel Wilkerson's letters, Warmth of Other Suns. And then finally, I tell you, one of the most moving books that I've read in the last couple of years, is Matthew Desmond's Evicted, which is the story of people who are caught in the cycle of eviction in this nation. And, I always say we should never deprive from another that which we would not deprive ourselves of. And then we should go about creating a world and society that doesn't deprive from another that which we would not deprive ourselves of. And none of us would deprive ourselves of a safe home to live in. Yet we deprive millions of people of that every day and then blame them for it. And no one, I don't believe anyone comes into this world and says, I can't wait to grow up and be evicted over and over and over again. And this is the most powerful book because it puts faces, names, and stories to people who are evicted every single day in this nation. And there should be no reason that people should not, and their children, the stories, this is generational, right? Of how these children get caught. And from the very beginning, they enter into circumstances in which their life is really charted for them because of this daggone ridiculous, unethical, sinful reality of eviction in this nation. And so that book, and particularly as this country has lifted the moratoriums on eviction in this country. So those are the books that speak to me right now, and the books that I have been reading and rereading.
Wow.
So good.
How powerful. Thank you for sharing that. I'm adding my reading list as we speak. Let me just mention one real quick one that I just finished. It's called Filled to be Emptied, The Path to Liberation for Privileged People by Brandon Robertson. So again, an opportunity for me to, learn and contemplate on that topic. So it was very, very helpful. But let's move on. Lisa, maybe you can start us off on the next round. This is intended to be a conversation about big issues, big things. So what do you believe currently is the biggest thing, the biggest, most pressing issue that we as compassionate Christians should be dealing with?
Well, I think you have to look at what's happening in Russia as an example, as a clear manifestation of the spirit that many of us are trying to beat back all over the world. And I think that what's happening in Russia is that Vladimir Putin is trying to resurrect the ghost of colonization. And he's trying to bring us back to that age of conquest, which many of us thought we were past, we were done with. I mean, especially with the fall of apartheid being the last of the colonized areas around the world. Well, not last, but the last to fall big in the 1990s. We thought that was done, and yet it's not done. We saw Crimea just snatched in 2014, and nobody did anything. And now we see a nation taking aggressive move to snatch another nation and commit genocide and ethnic cleansing in the process. And my second master's was in human rights at Columbia University. And so all my bells and whistles are going off. But the thing that has really been striking me is that after 30 years of researching my family story and thinking very deeply about the question of white supremacy and white patriarchy in America, it's clear to me that actually the larger story that we are within America is the story of colonization. That is actually what we are fighting here. And it goes right down to the question of eviction. Kelly and Cannon Brown Douglas, when you mentioned that hit me, because one of the themes that comes up again and again in Fortune is the removal from land. It's not only the Native American removals from land, but it's also African American removals from land by eminent domain, and also by just simply removing by terror, by terror with the KKK and lynchings and such, and massacres. So the claiming of land, the acquisition of land and people in order to exploit for resources is the thing that we are really in the middle of. And that is the thing that needs to be beaten back. And race and white supremacy is really only a tool. It's a weapon in order to achieve the end goal, which is complete control of land and resources. It's colonization. And so when I ask the question then of what is the work of the church in that context, in the context of really a struggle that's not just a struggle for white men to gain power, which is really, it's how we see it. It's how we experience it in America. But it's actually the struggle for complete control of the earth. It's really actually a war against God. It's actually a war waged by white men who are European or European descent to war with God for supremacy on the earth, because they are very willing to crush the image of God on the earth, and to exploit that image for their own well-being. When you look at the larger story, though, the question I have to ask is, well, how does this impact our faith? I think that the scripture itself was colonized. I think that our read of the scripture was colonized. I'm blown away when I think of the reality that not one European wrote one jot or tittle of the entire scripture, not one. And yet the locus of who gets to determine what is orthodox is in Europe. How could that be? The locus of who gets to determine how these brown, colonized, indigenous people, what they meant when they wrote X, Y, and Z, happens to be the very people who colonized them. The people from white supremacist European empire Rome and beyond. When you think Germany, you think Even Switzerland, no, they did not own slaves, but they were huge financiers of the transatlantic slave trade. And even when you look at our fathers of our faith, and that should be a clue right there that they're fathers of the faith. Hello. But you have Calvin and Luther. Calvin was in Switzerland, and his Calvinism did not stop Switzerland from becoming a major financier of the transatlantic slave trade. That's a problem when you understand that the people that this faith is about were serially enslaved and colonized as they wrote most of that text, or under the threat of colonization, as is the case with David and Solomon. So, when I think about what do we need to do over the next 10 years, the next decade, the next generation, what needs to happen is we need to be decolonizing our read of the scripture. And we need to be pushing for the decolonization of our institutions and the way that we do life together.
Wow.
Our governance.
How powerful. Thank you so much for that. You said several different things, Lisa, that I really appreciate it in terms of, I hadn't really thought of it that way before, at least not to the depth that you expressed it. So thank you very much for that. I mean, it really is a war against God. There's no other way to frame it at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm.
So Kelly, what would you like to share?
Well, how do I follow that? Because I really think, thank you, Lisa, that you set sort of the meta frame for what we're talking about here. And I believe that, when we talk about colonization and white supremacy, these two things go together. They are not, they're intrinsically related to one another, because that's what white supremacy does.
Mm-hmm.
That's what it means to be a white supremacist, is that you're going to colonize the world and try to create it in your own image and expunge those people who don't reflect that notion of what it means to be human, that notion of what I call Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism. And that's what we're seeing across the globe. That's what, Macron's trying to fight off. I mean, it's and fended off in France in the last election, but just the reality of this kind of white supremacist politic and morality that's sweeping the globe. Let me just point out one thing before I add my piece to it. When you talk, I think what's going on in Ukraine on many levels is reflective of a wider issue and all of the intricate realities, not only in the way in which you spoke to that so well, Lisa, but I remember my son and I, as my book reflects, have conversations a lot via text or iPhone, of that generation. And he texted me late one night, and he usually says, "So have you seen the news?" And it's like, well, "Have you seen the news?" And I'm like, and I know that means there's something that I need to be thinking about, that he's going to push me on again theologically or something. And I said, well, I've seen it, but what did I not see? And he said, "What's going on in Ukraine?" And we've been talking about Ukraine for a while, but he just saw the images in Ukraine of them not allowing people of the African diaspora
Yes,
to get on buses and trains, get out of there. And his response was, here these people, and I use his words, are getting ready to be nuked into dinosaurs, and they still find time to be white racists.
Wow.
I've
seen that.
What do you say about that? And the fact, we saw the images, of course, and then CNN didn't even note the images where you would see these lines of people getting on buses, and there would be a line with nothing but Black people in it. Now, this wasn't why are all the Black kids sitting together in the cafeteria.
No.
There's a reason that is a segregated line, and they didn't comment on it. It's like, there's an elephant in the room here, and so it's the elephant of race. It's the elephant of white supremacy, that even in these dire circumstances, people find a way to still allow this white supremacist instinct, Parker Palmer, to emerge, this white privilege to emerge, and not to see these people who are blessed with ebony grace as human beings. Who too have families, who too need refuge from what you're talking about, Sharon, Lisa, in terms of what's going on with Russia and colonization, et cetera, et cetera. So I think this points to a deeper concern, and it is the concern of all of us who would claim to be people of faith, people a part of faith and religious communities, and that there is a lack of moral clarity. We have lost our moral core and our clarity. That has been confused or overtaken by, however, corrupted by not simply political realities, but by these realities that give birth to things like white supremacy. We have lost, I think, our way as human beings, humanity. Our humanity is inextricably connected to who we are as moral beings. And I declare, Brian, that really at the heart of who we are, we know right from wrong. But that doesn't mean we're going to do it. I remember the late Archbishop Desmond Tutu would always say that, we are all children of God. That's a fact. That we act like it is not a fact. It's a call. And we no longer have the consistent moral voice in the public square. That is the job of those of us who would claim to be faith leaders, religious leaders. We are to be held accountable not to the way things are, not to the status quo, not to our present realities and understandings and moral realities of what justice looks like. We are to be held accountable to the more just future of gods that we claim to believe in. And that's what we are supposed to make real, hold ourselves accountable to expand the moral imaginary of our world, of our society, of who we are. And so that, to me, and all of the issues that really we're coming up against in this nation, which we're all going to end up being, in the words of my son, dinosaurs, if in fact we don't begin to find a way to reclaim our humanity and to recognize the humanity in the person next to us that we are refusing to let get on the bus. And that's the responsibility. If we got one job to do as faith leaders, and that is to remind us of who God has not simply created us to be, but who God has called us into life to be. That's our one job. That's what we're supposed to do. And so we now need to get about the business of doing that and be the people that lead the way to a different future. And we have not.
Amen. Amen. Well, what a call. But we need to listen to that call. Parker, could you finish us up?
Not likely. And I don't think we should finish. It seems to me that I know this webinar has to end, but the conversation that Kelly and Lisa have initiated here, have carried on here, needs to go on and on and on. And I think the biggest challenge facing progressive Christianity is the simple question, is there a congregation anywhere who would let this go on and on and on, not as a couple of invited lectures from two very engaging theologians, human beings, intellectuals, actors on the scene who embody what they're talking about, not as a lecture, but as a deep engagement within the life of that congregation that has the potential to be transformational. Is there a congregation in the land where that would be possible? If so, what's the number on that? My guess is it's very, very small. Very, very small. And precisely because of some of the dynamics of the colonization of Christianity and the ownership of Christianity by white patriarchy and white supremacy, which incidentally goes hand in hand with an utter denial of anything vaguely resembling white privilege even, let alone supremacy. I don't have white privilege. I have a white cousin who didn't get the job he wanted. What about that? Easy, it's low-hanging fruit, but the conversation has to happen for there to be transformation. And I think the simple, raw, tragic fact of the matter is there are not many church spaces that are capable of holding this conversation in a sustained and transformational way. I frankly don't think there are a lot of theological seminaries who are preparing leaders to be that kind of leader, to create congregational spaces that are anything other than kind of vaguely pastoral and functional from a business standpoint. And I know that both Lisa and Kelly will share that concern, and they're more engaged in the heart of this enterprise than I am. This again is where Thomas Merton informs me, and I just came prepared to read one quote from him, which I think is strangely apropos at this moment when I'm filled with feeling, energy for change, energy for engagement. And I suspect, Brian, that more than a few of the folks who've listened to Kelly and Lisa are as well. So this is from Merton's essay book called Raids on the Unspeakable, a title I've always loved. Both of these good people have been making raids on the unspeakable during the last hour. And I love the fact that they're speaking it and embodying it. So here's Merton. This is, of course, the ultimate temptation of Christianity, to say that Christ has locked all the doors, has given one answer, settled everything and departed, leaving all life enclosed in the frightful consistency of a system outside of which there is seriousness and damnation, inside of which there is the intolerable flippancy of the saved, while nowhere is there any place left for the mystery of the freedom of divine mercy, which alone is truly serious and worthy of being taken seriously. I don't think you have to parse that for too long to understand that the idolatrous attitude toward the gospel that Merton has just described is a product of the kind of white ownership of the enterprise that's been going on almost since the beginning of Christian time, certainly since the 4th century. So I think the litmus test is right here, and it's pretty simple. Can you or can you not have this conversation in a sustained and transformational way? And maybe that would be one place to land this very large and important dialogue.
Well, it's clear that we could sustain a very meaningful conversation with you guys for hours. I wish we could do that, but I have to think about, how I want to continue, and I certainly want to continue with the three of you. So we'll circle back, at some point in the future to talk more. But thank you all so much for this incredibly rich and deep discussion. I just love you all, and love what you're doing. And thank you so much for what you're bringing to the world to help us all, because we dearly need it. On Thursday, we're going to have 3 additional panelists: Sarah Bessie, Brandon Robertson, and Willard Ashley. Next Tuesday, we'll have Matthew Paul Turner, Kirsten Powers, and Mickey Scott Bay Jones. And then on Thursday, May 5th, Leah Gunning Francis, Mark Feldmeyer, and Daniel Bowman Jr. So all of these are recorded. If you don't make them live, you can watch them later, which is, I know, what most people do. Kelly, Lisa, and Parker, I can't thank you enough for participating in this. Please stay in touch and, grace us with, your presence again.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thanks so much, everyone. Bye for now.